Winter 878. It had been a swift-footed, lively housekeeper, black hair parted under a mob cap, chatting 19 to the dozen who had, the second night in Doya, taken her to a blanket and straw bed at the back of the kitchen with the other servants. The woman might have taken her the first night, except the drinking had gone on so long into the early hours of 1st November that Osrith bowled along with Domhnall's other warriors to the stables, where she had been awoken, lying between Finoli and Fergus, by an irate stable master. Osrith had been first to awake, and had been spoken to at length by the man, catching only about one word in 7 and understanding even less. She did understand a pail of icy water over her for her insolence and being knocked to the ground before the third of Domhnall's warriors, Dadg, a blonde-haired, wiry boy of about 19, sprang at him, screaming a stream of equally unintelligible words back. Finoli had pulled him off, and the commotion had brought a worse-for-wear Domhnall into the stable, barking orders at each of them, before hauling Osrith off to the fortress. Aunt Muir will not permit you to reside with the men, Domhnall explained. I know you desire to be a warrior, Osrith. However, while we live here, I have another role for you. Osrith had then been sent off to the kitchens, to help the elderly cook prepare the All Saints' feast, a slight man who turned out to be deaf, and whose words made a little more sense. She supposed that there weren't that many ways to say meat and vegetables in Gaelic, no matter the dialect, and she soon fell into the routine, so similar it had been to Dunnottar Castle. But it took until the morning after that, having been woken early in the servants' sleeping quarter at the back of the kitchen to be told what she must do. The children need to be taught, Domhnall explained, as he took Osrith to see his aunt. And they need to practice their learning. Osrith protested that while she could read and write, she was not a scholar, nor did she know enough Gaelic even to write it. Your role will be to see the children complete what the monks tell them they must do. Since I brought the Iona manuscript, they have been busy completing it and binding it. They do not have time to wait for the children to complete it. Ah, he said, opening the door to the royal rooms. This is my aunt, Domhnall explained, as the woman, who had been by the king's side, nodded. She was beautiful. Long, black hair, framed skin that was milk white. She wore a linen dress dyed dark yellow with lichen, and around her waist a circlet of beaded chain on which hung a key. Domhnall waited beside Osrith, but his aunt said, I would speak with this girl alone, narrowing her eyes at Osrith as the door clicked behind her nephew. You are a servant of Domhnall, and a companion of Constantine, Muir said, looking at Osrith with curiosity. And your family were murdered as you travelled to Iona? Yes, lady, nodded Osrith. And, you have a sword. My father's, your father's sword. Muir looked at her again. And you are 15, 13, lady. And you were educated, at home, by my father. Osrith's responses had been direct and prompt. Yet, this woman, the daughter of Sained Mackay Tildalpin, was intelligent and shrewd. She watched as Mal Muir narrowed her eyes. Osrith shuddered as she considered her limited options, for, if she did indeed believe her to be Elfric's niece, Osrith had walked freely into a trap of her own making. She felt her sword hand lower. It would be her only chance. But instead, Muir smiled warmly, then took Osrith's hands in her own, looking at the damaged one, with the square arrow bolt scar. My brother chose to be kind to you, she nodded. For you saved Constantine's life. And you have inspired Domhnall's respect, a very difficult thing to do. My nephew does not impress easily. You fought in battle. All that is incredible for a girl of your age. Incredible, thought Osrith, grimly. It was that, or become a peace cow. Poor Edra, as she had once been, would be violated night after night, and probably murdered, for the Danes perhaps to send muscle to Elfric, if he was lucky. It is also not an acceptable role for you, the UA tilde negation NA tilde Diarus Cecil Queen continued. While you stay with us, you will not fight our warriors in Ireland, will not tolerate women fighting, that is men's business, no matter what the degenerate Picts do. No, lady. Muir held out her hand to Osrith. who stepped forward as the queen took her shoulders. "Your father taught you to fight?" Osrith nodded. "We lived at Seahuis as we were often raided by Norse and Danes. I have killed many, but you will fight none here. My husband has his own way of dealing with the Norse, and it proves effective." Osrith felt her hand moving to the hilt of her sword again. Muir laughed. "As it is so precious to you, I will not take it from you. But you must not carry it." She stepped back from Osrith. "It will be in my care, as the royal children are in yours. Mary, Ira and Gormleth, my own son, Neil and my other nephews, Maldub and Malduin, they will be your charges." "Come, Queen." Malmuir walked towards an oak door opposite the one through which she and Domhnall had come. Beyond, in various pursuits of sewing, swordplay and a game of stones, the children were busy, under the watchful eye of one of the older servants Osrith recalled seeing in the kitchen. Muir called the children to her as Osrith looked at their faces. The girls were older than the boys, a little younger than her. Muir explained she had an older son, Domhnall, named after Domhnall, who was old enough to study with the priests alongside his sword work. "He and Constantine are well matched," Muir added. "They are both keeping my husband busy in teaching them." The last child, a boy of about 6, was brought in from the woods when his mother noticed he was missing. On this cold November morning he was without his trousers and it looked as if he had been walking around in mud on his knees. "I found worms," Neil said, holding up a handful as his mother expressed horror at his appearance. Osrith found herself suppressing a giggle. Muir then instructed Marsaeli to clean him and dress him again. "Without the worms," she added, then led Osrith back to her own room. "You will continue in the kitchens today and we'll take the children over to the monastery after breakfast tomorrow," Muir instructed. "When they are in your charge, you must ensure their work is done, and return them in the evening to the nursery. You should have free time to wash before dinner." "May I leave the fortress?" Osrith asked. "When the children are not required to work." "If you do not want to live," Muir replied, "I can fight." Osrith pressed. Muir smiled. "You have never seen an Irish Gael fight. And there are Norse." She put a hand on Osrith's shoulder. "While I do not keep you here as a prisoner, will you respect what is asked of you?" 88,888,888. Osrith, to her surprise, found that she liked the children and looked forward to their daily progress over to the monastery. Midwinter turned to spring. Birds chirruped and built nests and her little party of 6 children would walk in line over to the great archway of the monastery. The girls were very proper, though would answer her back in Gaelic when she gave instructions, and Osrith was not altogether certain that Mary was being polite, for she would often watch the very end of what might have been a smirk as the girl looked round to Ira and Gormleth. The boys, when she had finally got them used to sitting at a table and copying from a large ledger of bound manuscripts, some in Gaelic, some in an alphabet Osrith had never seen before, made of lines at different angles, were compliant. At the end, as they walked back to the castle, would all beg Osrith for a story, and they in turn would tell her one they knew. Whatever happened, though, Neil always seemed to be in a filthy state, either before Osrith took her or on their way back, that his mother began to call him Grubby Knees, though he could be bribed into keeping clean with a spoonful of honey via the kitchens. One morning, as the night frost had still not begun to melt and a brisk breeze blew in from the northern sea, Osrith's attention was caught as something flew through the air and caught her above the temple. She turned to find another whistling through the crisp air, this time landing just beyond Gormleth's feet. The girl jumped, gasping at the near miss. From the far corner of the courtyard, 2 warriors, who had been engaging in morning sword training, were staring at Osrith's little group. Another stone came, and Neil howled, clinging to Osrith's legs. "Charnail Tilg Clacken!" Osrith shouted, as she bent to comfort little Grubby Knees. The stone had skimmed the top of his head and had begun to bleed. She kissed it, pulling him close as another stone flew by. "Charnail Tilg Clacken!" Prince Domhnall, Findlaith's eldest son, imitated her imperfect Irish. "Na Tilg, Salashada Picton." He threw another stone and laughed when it hit his brother again. "Tell him to stop," Osrith shouted to his opponent. as she hurried the children towards the monastery. Constantine, the opponent, turned to Domnall, muttering something. Domnall laughed, and looked at Osrith. Abeltha Bugail, is she a boy? Thamay tilde negation Bugail lagam, shouted back Osrith, awkwardly. I am a boy. Nakalian, not a girl. Is this right? Laughed Domnall, mockingly, to his cousin. She is a boy. She does do as a boy does, Constantine confirmed. She can fight. Domnall looked back at Osrith. Can she hump serving wenches? Domnall called out her. But Osrith had turned her head and continued to walk towards the monastery. You, girl, Domnall shouted. I'm talking to you. But Osrith would not look at him. And she is a servant, bawled Domnall to Constantine, outraged that a servant had ignored him. He bent to take up a stone, much larger than the pebbles he had thrown before. Osrith stepped in front of little Malduin, who it would have certainly hit if she hadn't. Instead, it bounced off her thigh, painfully, and deflected down into the mud. You know she can kill you? Constantine said to his with interest. She fought beside Domnall, defended him as he killed Ivar the Boneless. I saw her, he added, as Domnall looked at Constantine with incredulity. I have seen her kill a dozen Norse, he added, grumpily. Then, let's just very well see. Without any time for Constantine to stop him, Domnall had wrenched his cousin's sword from him. Stalking over to Osrith, he thrust it onto the floor in front of her. Osrith said nothing, looking from the sword to the boy not much older than she was, leaving the blade where it was. She made to continue to the monastery, nodding at the two girls to go on and scooping up Neil and giving him to Mary, then taking Maldub and Malduin, one arm round each. Lies! Screamed Domnall, charging at her. Gormlith screamed, and the boys ran towards their sister as Domnall ran towards Osrith. He would have skewered her shoulder had she not sprang out of the way. The boy turned and ran at her again. Osrith ducked, this time, seizing up the sword from the mud, ducking again as a slicing blow came her way. She swung upwards with Constantine's sword, blocking another, knowing she must not be on the offensive. But this boy had to stop, or he would kill her. A shout from the monastery brought monks to the door, one ushering in the children. More people gathered to watch. You cannot throw stones at the children, Osrith shouted to him. Domnall pushed again, and Osrith slipped a little in the mud. I will not fight you. Then, I will kill you, Pictish scum. Domnall screamed back, in triumph, and he drove his sword down, and down. Osrith fought. Down near his legs she saw her chance and, using Constantine's sword for balance, got low to her feet and drove against the soft ground. She slipped, but it was enough as she wrapped her arms around both legs, her cheek by his thigh. Domnall didn't fall, but it was enough to stop a third assault, and he staggered back as Osrith raised Constantine's sword again, burying his blow, driving him back again. She was aware of eyes on her, but as a periphery, background, as she continued to press her advantage. She could kill him now, Osrith knew. 2 steps, 2 more blows, and he gone. Then she stopped, for behind her arms held hers. Osrith staggered back, as Domnall got to his feet. A smirk played at the corner of his lips as she backed into he who had restrained her. Osrith struggled, trying to worm away, but an arm wound round her neck. Domnall strode over to her leeringly, but Findlaith, the king, pushed his son away. You fought well, for a Pictish boy, he growled, close to her head. Domnall stared at his father, sullenly. Osrith tried to move again, but the king held her fast, leaning over by her head, his orange-red beard flowing into her eyeline. Do you know what we do with boys from Alba? He asked ferociously, close to her ear. We take them by the ankles and swing them over our heads till they fly back over the Irish Sea and land with their asses in the water. Osrith found she was trembling as that broke into a rumbling guffaw. Domnall stalked, scowling towards them, sword raised in Osrith. You leave this boy to his work, the king shouted at his son, tremulously. He could show you some things. She is a girl, at her, shot back Domnall. Osrith shuddered as the king reached down her chest, hand flat, then squeezed at her, closing her eyes as he pressed her back against his towering body. A lump pressed into her back. Then the king laughed heartily. "Go, girl, to your job, then that may still yet keep my elder son alive." Osrith staggered a little in the mud, not daring to turn round to look at the king, and stalked through the damp mud. The children were waiting for her, eyes wide. "I wonder who will hump her first, I or my father," Domnall shouted, smirking at Constantine. He picked up Constantine's sword and threw it low in his direction. "She has chosen chastity," Osrith heard Constantine shout back. "She will fight anyone who tries." "Not if the guards hold her down, she won't." From the doors of the monastery, Osrith turned as a huge clatter of metal reverberated from the ground. Constantine had charged at his cousin, feet kicking, fists striking, spilling blood until Finoli and Fergus, 10 minutes later, pulled him off. Later that night, when she had served on dinner duty for the royal family, Domnall's eyes on her all the time and the king laughing heartily when she was close, Osrith made her way wearily back to the kitchens. The cook had made a vegetable stew again that night, water, seaweed and tubers into which he dropped a scalding hot stone from the fire. When Osrith approached with a bowl, the cook shot out a hand and pushed her away. When she tried again, the cook took a wooden spoon and beat her over the arms and face until she retreated back to her bed. It was Finoli who crept into the kitchen later on that night, with ale and bread. He seemed somehow elated, his face beamed, his skin seemed somehow to glow, yet a part of him seemed harassed, as if he'd fought 1,000 battles. "Because you fought with Domnall," he explained, tearing some bread up, kindly, then pushing the ale jar into her other hand. Osrith supped deeply from the jar, and bit at the bread, hungrily before thanking him profusely. "Not me," Finoli replied, sinking back against the wall. From Domnall, 88,888,888. "I do not care what provoked it." Osrith was standing in Queen Muir's chambers again, where she had been when the queen told her she was to care for the royal children. "You should be flogged by my son." However, the queen broke off as Osrith looked back at her, impassively. Flogging a servant for defiance was typical. "However, come, sit child." She gestured towards a window seat, and sat herself. "What of your life, girl? For you do not come from a noble family." "My family were not badly off," Osrith recited the padded story. "My father owned a fishing fleet. He taught me and my elder brother to fight, to defend ourselves from Danes." She sighed, remembering the prone body of the father of the family, remembering them all, even the small children, hacked to death by the Norse invaders. "And for what?" "We were on our way to give thanks at that most holiest of places when we were attacked." Osrith looked down at her hands, looking at the one bearing the square scar of the arrow, already a year old. That morning, as if his assault on her had never been, the cook had woken her early and fed the servants what they called congay, a thin, milk-water food mixed with oats. Osrith had not denied any, though had then dropped a bowl of by trying to grasp it with her damaged left hand. He had beaten her about the head a few times, before grumbling off by himself. She had heard the serving girls laughing, running off when they knew Osrith had heard them, muttering fast in Irish, knowing she understood little. Osrith had caught words she did know, cure, blar and also, Constantine, and she also thought she heard Salishinda Picton. How many people had watched her fight the prince? The servants, clearly. "You know that my nephew Domnall was entrusted to bring manuscripts from Iona and Chaldes to us, for safekeeping." Muir's face was one of tranquility, and Osrith realized that the negation Sicil queen had them, simply and plainly in her lap. Osrith looked down. If the monks had meant for these sheets of calfskin, scraped and dried, stretched and wetted, to illustrate the glory and might of God's heaven in red lead and ochre, of indigo, lichen purple edged in soot black, gold of orpiment, then they had certainly managed it. With the morning sunlight, the colors looked as if they filled the room with their magnificence. Often, she had seen the monks in Comsil Monastery working over pages such as these, individual pots of pigments before them, the left wing of a goose to sit well in their right hand, which the scribes would sharpen periodically with a small blade. It is glorious to behold, is it not? Queen Muir said softly. Osrith felt herself nodding in agreement. They are the Gospels, begun at Durham, sent for safety to Lindisfarne and brought, with the pilgrimage that you were on, says Domhnall, to Culdees. It was taken on to Iona, but still they have not been safe from raids, and therefore, unfinished. Muir placed the Gospel pages carefully on a polished oak table beside her, drawing an assortment of scrolls and parchments into her lap. My nephew also brought these letters and testaments, land deeds and histories, all manner of correspondence, religious and secular, some for us here at the Comsill Monastery, some for monks at Kells. For example, Muir laid the missives in her lap. Norse raid our Western Isles, take sheep and land. Danes raid south of the Great Wall, taking land and slaughtering thousands. They have names, these Danes, Eric, Siegfried. She peered closely. Sven, Kjartan. Ragnar. Muir laid it aside, then asked, Osrith? Osrith opened her eyes. She had screwed them up as the Queen recited the names, for she was certain she was going to hear one more. Edra. We are all kin of Sna. Copyright L. No gain, went on Muir, putting down the papers, including Domhnall and Constantine. Yet, they are also kin to the Strathclyde Cymric, tracing their way back to ancient times. Eochaid is challenging my brother on that point for control of the Pictish throne. Osrith nodded. Her Aunt Jaitha, that is to say, her own mother, who had been forced to marry her uncle Elfric, who had made Booker baptize Utad when her father had changed it from Osbert, had been of Vsht. She was Christian, but had some strange ideas. Osrith was half Briton as well as Saxon. Kingdoms are easy or on the same land, especially if the invaders come, as the Norse have come. My brother'd freed the world when Domhnall slayed Ivar the Boneless. Yet Ivar Ivarson is still the scourge of the sea coasts. It does my heart no good to see the Ullaid harassed, yet they are our ancient enemy. But for the expulsion of the North I would see an island under one king. She sighed and looked at Osrith. Even we, the North and South Macron Diarus Sicil, are watchful and guarded of one another rather than friendly. For there are many contenders to be High King to take our lands outside the Norse. But, come, the Queen finished. She took with her the letters and manuscripts and they made their way across to the monastery. You can read? Muir asked Osrith, as she gave the richly illuminated manuscript book to the abbot. Father believed I should. Osrith nodded, as a less senior monk, young and fresh-faced, relieved the Queen of the parchments, papers and scrolls. Father Bicker that was, Osrith added. I believe you have been at Lindisfarne? Osrith nodded. One night technically counted. Then you would have seen the monks at work, in the words of our Lord. Osrith nodded again. These Gospels are unfinished, Muir explained. The Lindisfarne monk, Brother Connecticut, who worked on these was a master. No other Gospels like these have ever been produced. Yet, Connecticut was murdered on a raid by Danes. They were sent to Culdees by arrangement of my brother, but when no one skillful enough could be found, he tried again at Iona and then at Ratlin. So, Domhnall saw fit to bring them to me. And yet still, I fear, that we may not finish them. Muir led Osrith back to the castle and to her own chambers. She then held Sunthine out to her. Osrith stared into the Queen's milk-white hand, at what looked like a large globule of snot. It is a squid, from Loch Foyle. She held the Dead Sea creature flat on her palm. Osrith could see the tiny lines and dark sections within the small animal. It is only in these months, until the harvest, that these will be available on the coast. Our monks desperately need them for the dark blue pigment they give. The Queen pointed to a section at the back of the squid, where a dark spot, darker than the rest, sat heavy. If the Gospels are to be finished, and the word of the Lord be heard, you must find as many of these as you can when next you stride the northern shore for seaweed. Bring them to me. But, my lady, how will I know where to look? I am given to understand they bask in the shallows. The Queen smiled. Go as far as you wish, but remember, you are close to Ullaid territory. And, too, heathen folk comb the shores for substances for their unholy rites. And then, before Osrith had time to reply, Muir put down the sea creature and walked over to a door, through which she walked, coming back with something far more precious in her hands. Feather sword. The word escaped Osrith's mouth before she could stop it, the sheen of the scabbard flashing almost as brightly as the illuminations of the Gospel pages. You will need protection, although, I saw how you fought my son, the Queen said, handing it to Osrith. No allied warrior will live if they attack you, my dear. I can spare no guards to search the beach, neither can other servants go, unprotected. Deep into that night, as the moon rose and owls twit-wooed to one another, Osrith crept over to the monastery. It was true what she told Malmuir about being able to read. She had also seen where the Queen had placed the manuscripts. Lighting a candle at one corner of the scriptorium, Osrith took them up, fed a sword by her side, and read, and read and read. She read how her brother had been taken prisoner, then adopted by Danes, how he had burned down his adopted father's settlement. Osrith looked at the words telling her how he had become a warrior in a far-off kingdom called Wessex, and another that had condemned him for slaughtering innocent Britons in Cornwall, married, then abandoned, a wife called Mildred, become a father AMD suffered under a cumulative tax, which he could not pay, and how, too, he had stood side by side next to Alfred of Wessex, as the king had sent for aid across his kingdom for the Saxons' last stand against the Danes. And they had come, and Alfred had led them to victory at a place called Ethandun. Yet, Osrith wondered, why was it they called Utad an ungodly Dane? As the sun sent out its early warning colors of pale gold and blue underlining the last of the night's darkness, Osrith's heart sang as she read letter after letter, replacing them carefully in turn. Read just one last thing. With her brother in Wessex was Father Booker. She could not help it. As she crept from the monastery, knowing that it would only be a few hours before she would arrive with the royal children, Osrith realized how important to her this information was, and her heart glowed with happiness. She had gone to search for any reference to herself, missing from Bibbenberg, and instead, she now knew exactly where her brother was. 88,888,888. It was that evening that the chef gave her the basket she used for seaweed, so the very next dawn Osrith made her way the several miles upriver to where it opened into an estuary, and then a lock. The sun wasn't up yet, and it was very cold, yet there was a lightness in her step as she nursed the secret of her brother in her chest. The coast was as Muir had explained. Now, as summer was beginning, the squid would populate their shallows, and it would be easy, after harvesting the seaweed, to bring back the squid as the tide receded, for they were washed up on the sand and could be picked up. Getting to higher ground, Osrith surveyed the land below, the sun's warmth on her face, remembering her first, and only, time of seeing him, riding as he had been, to Bibbenberg to threaten Elfric. Utad, in Wessex. But how was she to find him? At the palace, clearly. But, how to get there? She had a few silver coins from the treasure bag, last buried under Dunotter's spring. A handful of silver coins would not get her across the Irish Sea. How she longed to see him once again. In no time, as the sun rose, its rays strengthening, as it picking out clumps of seaweed deposited over the smooth, new sandy surface. They would eat well over the next few days, for the seaweed would be boiled and turned into a concentrated mush which the chef would fry, or mixed with tubers. It didn't take long for Osrith to find the squid. Tiny jelly balls dotted the coast, come to enjoy the warm midsummer waters, she assumed. She had the one the Queen had given her, and so far, as the breeze buffeted her plait, had found 7 of them. Maybe if she walked a little further east, she would find more. Muir wanted not just a hardful, but at least 1,000. The water felt warm as Osrith dipped her hand into the water. She cast around for the small masses of jelly, and her hand caught another, and she pulled it out, resting it on the seaweed in the basket. Resting her basket on the sand, Osrith decided to make the most of the warm water. She stripped off to her woolen undergarments, wading out until she was chest height in the hardy waves. Unplaiting her hair, Osrith rubbed a little bracken she had found on the higher ground through her hair and, reaching underneath her woolen clothing, rubbed over her body. Hair trailing, Osrith dived through the waves until she reached the shore, combing through her hair with a broken piece of razor shell until the pale, golden strands flowed to her waist. Osrith pulled on her clothes. They would dry in the sun, and smoothed down her hair again. She couldn't plait it herself though, instead she bound it loosely with the leather cord that Finoli had used. Perhaps he could do it again for her. She sat on the sand as gulls screamed overhead, flying vertically, bombing the sea for fish as rays of golden sunlight warming her face. Osrith felt happy for the first time she could remember. Utad was alive. And, not only alive, but doing well, having been enslaved, and escaped, as a warrior in a far-off southern kingdom. She had a little silver. It was tightly bound in the lining of her undergarments, not much, but a few coins, taken from the bag hidden under the rock in the spring water, gone now. No doubt it could buy passage, but where from? And where to? Even if she could prove herself as a warrior, could be paid, or travel, then she would. But Osrith knew, she must get across the sea, and that would require a boat, and a trustworthy boatman. Even after that, the Irish tongue, despite its similarity to Gaelish, was proving a barrier. And there was a good chance she could be picked up by slavers. Her eye wandered on the beach, looking at the smooth sand. Her prints tailed off between the two large cliffs through which she had walked. Now she looked, more prints trailed across the sand, coming from the east. A panic overcame Osrith as she looked round for her basket. For that morning's work. She got to her feet, looking round. Yet her sword was still the, whoever had taken it felt the seaweed and squid were more valuable. Just in the distance, Osrith could make out two figures, one smaller than the other, but they were not walking together. Indeed, the larger figure was stooping to look in rock pools.